Hi Steve, thanks for making the time to talk to us about your upcoming keynote. I think most of our EAWOP members know who you are, but for those who don't, can you maybe briefly introduce yourself to our members?
Sure, and thanks very much for inviting me to give the keynote and to talk a little bit about it here in this interview. So my name's Steve Kozlowski. I'm at Michigan State University. I'm in the Department of Psychology. I study organizational psychology, and I'm particularly interested in multi-level theory, so that's one of the things I've been able to help push along. I'm particularly interested in teams and team effectiveness, and more recently, which is I guess a combination of multi-level theory and team effectiveness, is really trying to push the methodology and the theory to look more at processes as dynamics that unfold over time, as opposed to the kind of static constructs that we tend to treat as process. So.
One of the key reasons, of course, why we invited you here is to talk about impact on policy, how our discipline, how our science can have more impact on policy. And we've been discussing that for a long time in EAWOP, and there's different perspectives. And one of my first questions to you is there a problem? Do you see a problem in the sort of impact we have or not?
So I can't speak to what it's like in Europe, but I can tell you what our experience is in the United States. And IO psychology is largely invisible. In the United States, it's the fastest growing profession. And yet, if I go to a cocktail party or I'm meeting a new person and you have a little chit chat and what do you do? I'm an organizational psychologist. Nobody knows what that is. Mostly we get overwhelmed by clinical psychology is what most people think about when they hear about psychology. And if I think back to our field, it's 100 years old. It started with a very pragmatic focus of wanting to influence life and make life better for regular folks at work, in school, at play. And that's about policy. And yet we're not really engaged in that conversation. Policy people think about economists. And we have a lot to offer because lots of people work, and they work for a big part of their lives. So I think it's important for us to gain more visibility and to be able to have a stronger voice to say about work and organizational effectiveness.
We can certainly relate to that in Europe. What you're describing is sort of the same experience that we're having. And it's strange to see that some other disciplines, for instance, economists, have much more impact on policy. So why is it so difficult for us as a discipline or psychologists to have this sort of impact?
I'm not sure why it's so difficult, right? I mean, you could speculate endlessly about that. I mean, maybe some of it's our training, right? We write a paper, it's about theory, it's about data, it's really science focused. And I think that's what the role of our journals is. Our journals are to publish science and scientific evidence. And to go to policy, you need two additional steps. You have to begin to translate what are the results to practical impact. We do that a little bit, but not enough. And then you need to move from that practical impact to, well, what does this mean for the public good? The theme of the conference. How do we influence legislation or the way in which resources that are part of society are being allocated. And we can play that role, but we haven't been trained to do that, and I think we tend to shy away from it. A lot of people are afraid to talk to the press. A lot of people are afraid to try to actually have that impact. So some of it, I think, is to get over that fear, and most of that is we haven't really tried.
I like that idea that we haven't tried, or maybe we don't have the skills. And a lot of us individually, but also as an association, would not know where to start. And for instance, we pick a team like the greater good, but what if no one's listening to us? So can you maybe give some examples of things that we could do or that PsyOP has done, of things that that have been very successful or influential?
Success is a work in progress, right? So I mean, in the keynote that I'll give, it's not like I'm a scholar of policy. I'm more of a practitioner who's been trained by the experiences that we've had, and really trying to help get PsyOP involved in trying to have an impact on policy. So I'm going to talk about those lessons. But I'd say there, at the macro level, there are two. One is that an association, a professional association like PsyOP or EAWOP or IAAP, whatever, needs to be committed to having that impact. It takes resources. It's going to take money. It's going to take volunteer time, and some of that might be to pay for professionals to help guide you. I mean, in SIOP's case, we need resources to have a guide in the center of power in Washington, D.C., and I would imagine the same would be true here. That's half the equation. The other half of the equation is essentially training the membership to get members, to get scientists and practitioners attuned to the idea that policy ought to be part of their profession, that the ability to influence public policy, how our science might be used to make things better in the workplace, but also in society in general, ought to be part of who we are and what we do. And that means getting the members trained and engaged and interested. And so those are two halves of the equation. And I would say we don't have the answer, but we're making progress on both sides.
I like that idea of it being a core part of our identity and not like outsourcing the communication or the impact, but making it core of our identity. What we've seen is that actually we have a lot of individual members approaching us and say, what can we do? Is there something that we can individually do? Is there something that they can do as individuals, or do we really need to approach it as a broader group and as an association?
Well, like I say, I think really both halves are important, and from a continuity and a kind of a consistency perspective, the professional association having a set of goals, targets, training, progress, that's a really important part. But I think training the membership so that they have a sense of what advocacy is, breaking down the barriers of ignorance, so to speak, and giving them the tools. What do you need to know to be an effective advocate is a very important part. And I think those two parts need to be able to work together. I think that's particularly, this would be my guess, but particularly likely to be the case with EAWOP, because EAWOP is so much more complicated than SIOP in that you have, I was looking at the program, 30 different constituencies that help form the conference, 26 or so different countries in Europe that are part of making up EAWOP, whereas SIOP is more of a national association with no representation at the state, or we have some local groups, but we're not sort of organized that way. So I think to some extent to get the membership of EAWOP to be attuned to local conditions in their nations and what are the important issues where work in organizational psychology could really help make a difference for the greater good has the potential to be a real force magnifier. And so giving people the skills and the inclination, getting them engaged, that's a big deal. And then do one thing. I mean, my advice to people is do one thing. Write a paper and be serious about your practical implications section, not the, you know what I'm talking about. Everyone's written one where they didn't really think that hard about it. Go interview some people. Get serious about how it would actually make a difference. Or write a chapter around translating science into some principles around application, which is a little bit higher level, right? It's a translation effect, moving from the science to what might be the precursor to policy. It's harder to do than you might think, but if you get a little practice, it gets a lot easier. Go meet a legislator, and talk about the work that you do, the science that you do, and how it might influence some important problem in your nation. Everybody could do one thing, you'd start to have a visible effect.
That's a great one thing. Thank you, that is really helpful, and we're very much looking forward to your keynote. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Frederick.
Thanks.